Yes, Guyana to the world.
Globospan is a Guyanese dialogue moving towards the realization of one nation in one Guyana. It's a platform that offers an all-inclusive discussion with the pros, the cons, the ones that is taken aside, and the ones that stand in the middle. Globospan believes agreeing and disagreeing are part of the nation's building.
She is a beauty, beautiful Guyana, with wonderful people all over this country.
Globospan believes every Guyanese voice is part of the nation's building. As we span the globe for voices from the diaspora and those living home, we stand on our commitment that we are all Guyanese working towards one nation in one Guyana. As the world turns on its axis bringing changes, we as Guyanese must adapt to those changes for a better Guyana for all. Globospan stands on its axis with its belief that one nation, one Guyana, one destiny must include voices from all corners of Guyana.
With many flavors, 6 different people blended together. Raise your flag high in unity, we're family with one destiny. Raise your flag high in unity.
Right. So good evening, ladies and gentlemen, for another edition of Globospan 24/7, owned and operated by Mr. Nohar Singh. Joining us, as usual, is Mr. Devin Bissoon as the technical operator. Tonight, we're discussing silencing of Indian history in Guyana, and perhaps one can even add the Caribbean as well. Our panelists tonight is Dr. Professor Betram Ramarak and Mr. Ravindra Dev. Neither one needs much introduction. They're well known, they're prolific writers, they're in media all the time in Guyana, and they're also on this network regularly. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us this evening. Let's begin with Mr. Betram Ramarak. If first he could talk about this concept of Indian history and the silencing of it. Give us an introduction, a background.
Well, Vish, I think maybe, well,
before you begin, if I may, Dr. Ramarak has written 2 books that recently came out, one last year, one this year. And if you want, I mean, he may be quite modest if he wishes to talk about them. They're 2 excellent books. Dr. Ramarak, rather than me introducing the books, why don't you talk about the 2 books and why they're relevant and how they are part of silencing Indian history as well, or the unsilencing of Indian history?
Well, I don't want to blow my own horn, but just very briefly, the book on Alice Bhagwande Singh came out last year, but it won the Guyana Prize, second prize, nonfiction that is. That was this year. And then this year I had a publication on the person who built the urban village of Prashad Nagar. His name is Hari Prashad. So I did the biography of him. So those 2 books were launched in Guyana. We did a presentation at the University of Guyana in May, and also both books were launched at Texila University in Guyana in May. They're available on Amazon. You can also get them at the at SVN, Swami Akshananda School in Guyana. So those are the 2 books. But if I can get back, by the way, there is also an interesting book that's coming out. Hopefully we can talk a little bit about it, which is on Janet Jagan sometime this month. If you want me to get back to your question that you raised.
Yeah, please. Yeah, please.
All right. All right. You know, basically what we do with these kinds of shows is we have the privilege here to talk about Indian history. We talked about an Indian narrative and so on. I think it's important for us to have that kind of a discussion. But I want to kind of get into this question about unsilencing the Indian voice, the Indian history, by giving some examples. And I hopefully with those examples, we can kind of talk about what it really means to unsilence that Indian voice. So
if before you do that, can you tell us, before we speak of unsilencing, there have to be silencing. Can you explain how the Indian history, Indian narrative has been silenced?
Well, when we talk about, the silencing of Indian history, it's important to go back to. There's always a reference to a book that I make reference to. It's called "Silencing the Past" by a Haitian anthropologist. So essentially, what we're seeing, in simple terms, is that the Indian voice, the Indian narrative, in a sense, is not out there. It's not being taken up as a challenge that demonstrate that people who are well versed in their history have a good understanding of who they are, right? So if that understanding of Indian history was out there and people were talking about that, they'd be very confident if they understood that history. And secondly, it means that if you understand your history, then you understand the past, right? In Ghana, we always say there's a phrase, man, you're bringing up, past story. That implies that we can't separate that past from who we are. So history has a connection. And if we don't understand that history, it means that we are prone to making some of the same mistakes that people made in the past. And I would add this by saying that understanding that history of who we are, it's also a sort of a therapeutic process, because the more you know about yourself, the more confident you will be as a person to speak about who you are. We have examples of Indians, for example, who are talking about all kinds of issues and everybody else's cause except their own. Right. So if you have a good sense of who you are, your history, and what your interests might be, then you wouldn't have a problem articulating those interests, right? Based on your experience, your history, your background, right? And this is what we talk about when we talk about having a narrative, because if your voice is not out there, right, and you don't know who you are, then it is very difficult for us to articulate that interest and what we stand for and how we can protect those interests. So when we talk about, the silencing of that history, that's basically what we're saying, right? It has to be unsilenced so you can have that voice, you can have that narrative out there. Otherwise, other people will be talking for you and making representation for you.
So the silencing of Indo-Guyanese Indian Caribbean history occurs because the mass media does not focus on historical presence of Indians. The curriculum in schools at CXC and so forth don't have much focus on Indian history. Usually, whoever controls the society, the dominant group, is the one that decide what will be the narrative. And so we have very little presence in the mass media. There is very little presence in the academic journals, academic pieces, magazines, and books on Indian history and the Indian presence in the Caribbean. Ravida, you want to further enlighten us about this silencing of Indian history and the attempt to unsilence it now?
Yeah, I think it's a critical point you make, Vishnu. Our people need to understand this. I mean, it's a truism that they say a tree without roots cannot stand. I mean, it's self-evident, but somehow Indians, a lot of our people, seem to believe that history is irrelevant. And your history are your roots. And the silencing comes about at several points. And the scholar who Beto refers to, his name is Trullo, and he says we should look at 4 points. One, at the moment of recording. Who decides if this is worthy to be in a press? Who decides that? And I'll give you an example from my own life example. When I came back to Guyana, for a while in the late 80s, early 90s, I was a columnist for the Starbuck News with David Icaries. And he very, in an enlightened fashion, allowed me to talk about ethnic politics and the Indian position on that. So one day I'd gone up to Govan John to commemorate Shivratri, as they do every year. I went to participate. And on returning, I noticed the following few days, there was nothing in the press. You were talking of an event that attracted over 20,000 persons passing through Cove and John Ashram, and not a single word in the press. So I asked David, DeCaires, that is, man, can I do an insert on this? Can I put in an insert into Starbuck News? Because you all haven't carried it. You all have decided it's not important enough. And I didn't really in any way fight him down or anything like that. He said, "Man, speak to my wife," and she handles the business side. So his wife, coincidentally, happens to be an Indian lady, Doreen. And I spoke to Doreen. I asked her, well, how much would it cost? I'll sponsor it and all that. And she told me that if you want to write about Shivratri, then go and publish your own paper. To my face, she told me that without any sense of irony and all that. So a decision was made at the editorial level for not publishing this thing about it's not important enough, an event that attracted over 20,000 persons. And here the business end of it, ironically being an Indian lady, decides that even as a business proposition. I, of course, went on to publish a newspaper. I flew up to Trinidad. It was called Caribbean Jahaji, and I published it for a number of years. I put together and then flew it back on BW, a very expensive proposition. The point I want to make at this very personal level, that I discovered very early on as to how the Indian presence in Guyana was seen. Even before that, while I was in New York, Starbuck News began publishing in '86 with the National Endowment for Democracy, the NED. They gave them $100,000 US, and David started publishing that to push quote unquote democracy in Guyana. And I used to go up to Queens from my home in Jersey, and every week to purchase a copy of the Starbuck News. And one day I saw a full spread middle page on Starbuck News that Indians are to join the mainstream of Guyana culture. So I then was amazed. I mean, here were Indians, were over 50% of the population, and they were supposed to join the mainstream. So I want to know, how does the Starbuck News measure streams? If Indians are the majority, how come they have to join in? So it then came to me very strongly that up to that time, there was this dominant view in Guyana as to what is Guyanese culture, who forms Guyanese culture, who are the real Guyanese, and who have to then jettison what they are to become that. And it was the Indians who had to jettison that. And as you said, Vishnu, and I'll pause here, this is the silencing. It happens, I said, for that matter, in who decides what is important. Then the second moment is that who decides whether to save that information, whether it's in the archive. Because if we want to do research in history, we have to go back to the archives. But did those who put matters in archive, did they feel it's important enough? The other one is for this creation of narratives. When you talk about who's a Guyanese, and we talk about Guyanese, and we talk about that, who decides who forms that? And the last one is when this thing you call about, when history is being written. Who decides out of all the possibilities out there, which events to pluck and make it part of history? And at those 4 points of the formation of the silencing, we have been at the receiving end. So as a result, right now in Guyana, still to today, there are these Indians who don't want to know about the history. It's not by accident. They don't see that history as being important because they didn't see that history in the newspapers. They didn't see it in the history books. They didn't see them in the school books. They didn't see them in the cinema. They didn't see them in art, in culture, or whatever.
On television.
So, or the television. And this is something, when you talk about the unsilencing now, it's a whole project that should unfold in all these aspects of human endeavor.
If I may, after that, when television was first introduced in Guyana, I think it was around 82, 83 or so, Indian shows, cultural shows, programs were not featured on television. And it didn't came about until I think with Sayan Sharma, who started the television late 80s or mid 80s and started showing these cultural programs on television.
And he was laughed at for being backward.
Yeah, he was laughed at, yes.
He was at the butt of every joke in Guyana that the person who shows Indian movies is backward. And the other thing, we have this tradition of our death announcement. So when he brought in death announcement, which is an Indian cultural thing, that you go around the village, somebody rings a bell, you get me? And they repeat the death announcement and will end it by saying, Mati tell Mati, friend tell friend. When Sian introduced that, he was laughed at again. And finally, Vera had to finally acknowledge that it's a commercial thing. But that wasn't the point. It wasn't the commercial aspects. It was the cultural aspect, that television. And as late as 2000, Beto Ram had come to Guyana, and we were, I think, announcing one of his books, his early books, where he reproduced the history of the Indians up to 1938. And we were at the Tower Hotel, and Jocelyn Dow of the WPA rose up and in great anger said she can't believe when she turns on the television. It's like she's in India. All of these, shows are on, what kind of all these shows are coming on about India this and India that. You get me? And to end this segment of even before television, there was radio. There were Indian songs were very popular over the radio, and there was a famous broadcaster by the name of Ishri Singh. And Ishri Singh is on record. It's on a YouTube out there in the high cyberspace, where he talks that one day, even though it's a sponsored program and people were paying to play these Indian songs, he was called in by Haywood Ben, who was the Minister of Culture or some such thing. And he was told that he has to include quote unquote English songs, which meant calypso or reggae or, whatever, Johnny Braff song like that. So at each stage, our culture and whatever was Indian was silenced. So unlike me, who grew up with Indian songs from Radio Radhika and from Ministry and so on was singing, those Indians who are now, they cringe when they hear Indian songs, is because they haven't been exposed to it. The other thing that they've been exposed to, hey, it's familiar. It's been, the fancy word has been normalized.
And on that note, I went to Skeldon, the Skeldon gathering, people of last Sunday at the park, and the band was singing "Here Auntie Bess," "Here Aunt," and I'm just thinking to myself, that is not part of Indian culture, "Here Auntie Bess," and they were very proud about it, that they were playing "Here Auntie Bess." Now, when I was growing up, when Auntie Bess was singing, we had certain words that we were saying, which I don't want to say over the air. So Indian people don't seem to understand their own culture, their own history, and how it was belittled, marginalized, scorned, ridiculed, and laughed at for decades, for centuries in Guyana and throughout Trinidad as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well,
Betram?
Well, I started out by there's something in my head. I wanted to give some examples, kind of break this down. To connect with what we are seeing. And there's some examples that I want to kind of share with you, which I think will explain to people who are watching what we're really talking about here. The first incident I want to share, and Vishnu would know about this, is, we were students in City College, right? I did my bachelor's in City College, and we had a club. Everybody had a club. There was a Chinese club, the African club, and all kinds of clubs. So we formed our own, the Indian club. And what we decided to do was we decided to invite a professor from Trinidad. His name is Kelvin Singh. He became I believe, the head of the department at UWE and so on. But he was a historian, and he's written about politics in Trinidad and race relations and so on. We invited him and we said, look, can you come to our campus in City College? And this was on a Thursday. That's when we have club hours. And we said, look, can you talk about Indian history? So we prepped him and we said, this is what our interests, and we paid his passage to come. So in his presentation, we had a room full of mostly Indians, right? There were about 2 or 3, Africans in the club who came to listen. So when Kelvin Singh and this professor began to give his lecture, an hour lecture, he spent about 55 minutes talking about the Black experience in the United States, about Marcus Garvey and MLK and so on. Of course, it was an important history, but that wasn't the reason why we brought him there. And he spent about 5 minutes talking about indenture history, not about current history, about what's happening in Trinidad. So that example to me, and I had my notebook trying to see if I can learn something about Indian history. We were young, we were students. The second example I want to give is this. And I mentioned earlier that there is a book coming out on Janet Jagan, and there's something that caught my attention. Incidentally, I did a review on the book, and it's going to be published in Stabroek News on Sunday. There was a report in the book where there was a group of members of the WPA and others who were launching the series of books that Walter Rodney had written, right? One of them on Indians was called, I believe it was Lakshmi Out of India. And the books were going to be presented and launched and discussed. And in that audience, there was a person by the name of Swami Aksharananda. And when they began to talk about Lakshmi Out of India, Swami Aksharananda, he dressed in his yellow outfit, he got up and he said, look.
Who had been a member of the WPA with Rodney.
Exactly. So he got up and said, look, there are some inconsistencies, there are some stereotypes that are mentioned, and I think we need to discuss these things. And they are mentioned in the book, and maybe Rodney did not understood these things. So there was another person in the audience, Vanda Radzik. I've never met her. But according to Fred Kissoon, she could be a member of the elite, the Creole class in Guyana. She made a statement, and this is quoted by the person who wrote the biography of Janet Jagan. She said, look, there was some Swami in the room, who got up and said something about Indians and that Rodney made a mistake. But Janet Jagan, she was an admirer of Janet, she said Janet Jagan got out of her seat and put that Swami guy in his place. So when you read that, the image that comes to my mind is that here is an Indian, he runs a school, Saraswati Vidya Niketan, one of the best schools in Guyana, right? So he is now expected to shut his mouth, fold his hand, and go into a corner and sit in a pura and listen carefully. So when we talk about the silencing of Indian history, you can't get more of a perfect example than this. And there are other examples in that book, and I'm sure when it's launched, you guys can read about it. But that's what we mean by silencing of Indian history. We are expected to appreciate the history of others and what others have written about our history, right? Because when we talk about our history, it means we are being triumphalist, we are being racist, right? We're being racialist and all these other words that are being thrown at us. The third example I want to give, which is more related to, what's happening in Guyana today. If you pick up last Sunday's Stabroek News, you look at the information that's presented. Anil Nanlad had written something about, the focus is on, there's going to be a state funeral for Sridhar Ramphal. Now, we don't speak ill of the dearly departed. The man was obviously important. He did a lot for the Caribbean, for the Commonwealth, for Guyana, and so on, right? And my mother always taught me, be nice to those people because they can always come back and haunt you. But be that as it may, the point is, when you look at the people who are paying tribute, right? Anil Nanlad wrote a very nice tribute about Ramphal. Ralph Ramkaran, in his Sunday column, wrote an extraordinary tribute. There was a diplomat who worked closely with Ramphal, wrote an extensive, again, all in the Stabric News on this Sunday. The only people who made mention of an asterisk about Ramphal that said basically, look, yes, he was important, he did all of these things, but he also supported a regime, uh, that did some terrible things to Indians. He was fighting against apartheid in South Africa, but you had, similar situations facing Indians in his own country. And again, keep in mind, Ramphal's father, James Ramphal, was very much involved in struggling to get the laws changed so that Indian women could be educated in the schools, right? But this is the point I'm trying to make here. Again, the only people who said, look, well, he's great, but there's some issues here. I think Vishnu wrote a letter, Chitla Rupnarayan wrote a letter, and somebody else who wrote the letter, I think his name was Devanand Bhagwan, says, look, this guy did some terrible things to people in Guyana. So the backlash, when you look at the backlash to what was said, and again, who was saying these things? It's three Indians, Vishnu, Chitlal, and you have Devanand, right? So it means the point I'm trying to make here is that, look, if we don't take charge, understand our history, right, and in a sense narrate our own history and put our history together, it means that we are forever going to be beholden to other people creating, as Ravi said, other people who have the power will dictate. And this is why I keep saying, and I come back to what I've been saying all the time on these shows, many times, that we don't have that strong, powerful Indian voice in Guyana, right? Ravi is the only person there, right, who could talk about things from an Indian perspective. Now I can go on, but I want to leave those examples here because I think those kind of give you a sense of what we mean by the fact that Indian narrative, the Indian history, need to be unsilenced.
In my engagement interaction with politicians in Guyana, they often query, by why I bring up them old thing this again, man? That past, I have done with that now. But the past is very, very important. Why is it that they're not saying that, well, history was the past, let's forget let's forget about slavery then. Let's forget about other injustices. If it is that you want to forget about indentureship and you want to forget the injustices unleashed on the Indian population. And I just want to throw in one other thing, and then we'll go on a break, and then Ravi will give a response. At City College, not only did we have, as you mentioned, the professor from Trinidad, we also had Brinsley Samaru was there. Professor Ken Ramchan also came. And all of their focus was not on the Indian presence and the Indian history and the injustices meted out to Indians, but they were talking about non-Indians, the African presence. It was as if the Indians never existed. So we'll come back now in after this break. Please watch.
Attention EBT and SNAP card holders. All-for-one-supplier.com is now accepting EBT, SNAP, and all other cards online. We are offering meals, pastries, fish meals, and all groceries delivered to your home. Get your West Indian chicken, goat and duck curries, rotis, doubles, plus vegetarian meal pastries, meat, fish, pepper sauce, curry powder, chow mein, and all other grocery needs. Shipped directly to your home. Use your EBT, SNAP, or any major credit card to purchase your food, doubles, and the groceries. We deliver in New York, Florida, Texas, Pennsylvania, California, and all other U.S. states. So if you live in Brooklyn, Queens, Long Island, upstate New York, Schenectady, Pennsylvania, Florida, Arizona, Texas, California, wherever you live in the U.S., log on to allforonesupplier.com and use your EBT, SNAP, or any major credit card, or call us for assistance at 718-551-3292. That's allforonesupplier.com.
So welcome back, viewers, listeners, to our edition of Silencing Indian History and the Unsilencing of Indian History. We are continuing our discussion with Professor Vedaram Ramarak and Ravindra Dev. Ravi, you want to chime in? And
Well, I was going back to Ramphal. I had read his autobiography, a rather large tome, 500 odd pages. And in the beginning, he acknowledges his roots in India, that his grandmother had come first to Suriname as an immigrant with her son. So then she, after serving her indentureship in Suriname, she went back to India. And then after being in India for a while, re-indentures again and comes to British Guyana then with that boy from 3 years old is now about 8 years old, and they come, and that is, she comes and is indentured to Plantation Friedenhoop in 1871. So Ramphal recounts all of these things but he takes time to recollect that he had written about this when he gave a speech in 1988 at a program that the PNC had launched called Genesis of a Nation. And in that speech, he talked about the Indian arrival into Guyana. But as Beto implied in another set of circumstances with other individuals, spent the greater amount of his time on the other groups in Guyana. So even he, while he acknowledges that his roots were from India, he gives short shrift to that in trying to prove that he was Guyanese. And this is the problem we have with many Indians even today, that the silencing has been so effective that they would go along willingly and blithely silencing their role or their historical role in the formation of the Guyana nation. And it was interesting that P.J. Patterson, Prime Minister of Jamaica, a firm supporter of reparations and the Black West Indian cause, when he reviewed the book, he said in a very condescending way to Ramphal that we should also acknowledge the arrival of Indians and, in parentheses, Chinese. So what I want to say at this juncture is that the silencing has been so effective that even in one of our most educated product from the Indian arrival, the descendants, even he gave short shrift to the Indian component of what it takes to be Guyanese. So when we blame the ordinary Indians, who was totally being confuffled, Sridhar Ramphal in his book shows he had the whole Secretariat of the Commonwealth at his fingertips to find out his antecedents. He has the arrival paper of his grandmother, his great-grandmother, and his grandfather, his son. You get me? But when he goes to India as part of a Commonwealth conference that is held in the city of Gaya in Bihar, he does not take a trip just 300 miles away to where his foreparent had come from. He has all the papers, he has the village, he has the district, he has the whole region, everything he has, all the details. So unlike, for example, Bastio Pandey of Trinidad, who took the time to go to his ancestral home, Ramphal never took that step. So it is something we must observe today, and I will come back again and again to this, because today in Guyana, all Indians aspire to become middle class. Their sons, their daughters should become lawyers and doctors and dentists and accountants and all that. But what we notice that even today, because of the silencing, almost all professionals, they keep their Indian heritage very much subdued. It never comes to the surface, rather rarely. And when it does come, it's with some acknowledgement of somehow, well, unfortunately, I have to say this. And that's how Ramphal came out with his acknowledging or acknowledgement of his Indian past. So it is something, so this silencing, like I said, is very relevant to us, very relevant to us. So, and I noticed, for example, and I'll close with this incident here. There was a long rigmarole going on in the newspaper by one fellow named Eric Phillips, who talks about a scheme that goes back all the way to 1919, where Locke had called for India, for Guyana to be an Indian colony because he was responding to the government of that time, the Guyana government of that time, wanting to restart emigration. And they're bringing something from 70 years back to show how dare you want to make Guyana a place for India. Yet today, without any irony and without any comment from Indians, I've been waiting quietly without saying anything, intervention, waiting. Today, the Caribbean, including Guyana, Trinidad, and Suriname, where Indians form the largest blocks, it has now been declared as the 6th region of Africa. And nobody has said a word. We, believe it or not, we are now the 6th region of Africa. And both Mia Motley and Keith Rowley again could say, well, Motley, there aren't many Indians in Guyana, but Keith could say very loudly, echoing Kwame Nkrumah, that I was not born in Africa, but Africa is born in me. Could you imagine any Indian professional in Guyana today, much less a politician, saying that today? And the question is, why? Why is it that they wouldn't feel comfortable to use that language, to say, well, Guyana, Trinidad, and Suriname should be the 19th region of India. I forget how many provinces India has, but use the same term, that if the Caribbean is the 6th region of Africa, why can't Guyana, Suriname, and Trinidad be the 19th region of India, assuming there are 18 provinces? I forget how many there are now. Ladies and gentlemen in the audience, those of you who are Guyanese, you may be African Guyanese, you may be Indian Guyanese, you may be Amerindian Guyanese. The point of this matter is that we should not have to denounce or in some way subdued what we are to fit in to be this thing called Guyanese. We should all be able to proudly acknowledge that, yes, we have these roots, and those roots are what contributed to what we are today.
Excellent. Excellent. Dr. Ramrat, how do we unsilence this, you know?
Well, first and foremost, we know why we're here, right? Historically, the voice has been silenced. But I think part of this has to do with education. You see, I always make the point that if I'm sick, I have to go to a medical doctor, right? We have spent much of our lives studying history and politics and so on. So whatever we discover, we know it has to have some significance, right? Because we try to analyze these things. And just to kind of, as a footnote here, one of the things that I've discovered, and again, this is an example of how education can liberate the mind. One of the things that I have discovered is that out of all of these diasporic communities where Indians were taken during colonialism, whether it's Fiji, Mauritius, Trinidad, South Africa, and so on, Guyana happens to be the only place where there have been a record of many, many rebellions on the plantations. No other colonial society where Indians were taken can match what happened in Guyana. We can go back, all the way to 1869 in Lenora. You have Devonshire Castle, 1872. Rose Hall in 1913. And by the way, Rose Hall in Berbice is the bloodiest one out of all of them, where 15 people were killed, about 40 or 50 people were injured. And I think Gayatri Bahadur made the point that for those who were injured because of the rapid fire of the weapon that they used, some of those people required amputation, and even amputation could not save them. But we don't hear about those history. Of course, we hear about and more is significant, right, for a modern political history. But the point is that information is there and it's available. And I think so part of the response to your question has to be the fact that we have to go back and look at our history and educate ourselves about who we are and learn about our history, because with that weapon, that knowledge, you can now talk about your own history publicly and freely without being silenced. So here's the other thing I want to mention about this history. It's also important, and I want to make this point very clear. We can't just simply take the narrative of those people who are writing about us, because we now have more knowledge, right? We have more information. And I spoke to Donald Ramatar, and I love Donald Ramatar if he's watching this weekend, and I try to make this point to him. We have to look back in terms of what is being recorded. And I'll tell you this, when you look at the Legislative Council debates, if you go back, and they're all found, in the Parliament building, there's a library there, you would see people like Jang Bahadur Singh, people like the Lacours, you would see people like Daniel Debedin. These people were very strong supporters, and they give support to Chetty in Parliament. But we don't know about that because here's a fellow like Debedin, who there's a label attached to him. He was a guy who initiated Apanjat. But the point is this: these people had a concern. They were very concerned about what was happening to Indians. We talk about 1919, this whole notion of what Eric Phillips is trying to to push, that narrative, which is a wrong narrative. But he forget to tell you that the leader of the trade union movement in Guyana, Critchlow, was a guy who was very much gung-ho with Ayub Idun, supported this whole notion of the franchise. But when it came to the right to vote, they extend that franchise. People like J.B. Singh says, yes, we need to go all the way. But Critchlow, realizing that the Indian population has been increasing, said, look, I'm going to make a volte face. I'm going to go back, and I don't really support that notion. But they forget to tell you that, right? But this is a guy whose statue was unveiled by Chetty, right? So when you go back and look at the history, educate yourself, these are the things that you will discover, and you have to try to reinterpret. It's not a matter of revising history. It's a matter of knowing your own history, and don't let other people, right? The example I gave about Vanda Radzik telling, Swami Akshananda to sit down and be quiet. It's a matter of learning and knowing your own history. And I want to make this last point, and I hope this doesn't come out the wrong way, right? But this is a matter of ignorance. And again, I'm not trying to be arrogant about this, but we are, in a sense, sometimes our own enemy. We have to go back and look at what was done when Indians remained silent. We talk about Brinsley Samaru, right? Who knew so much about Indian history, but was very silent about what was happening to Indians in Fiji and Suriname and Guyana and so on, right? So those voices, even among the people who should be speaking out, were not there. When I try to make the point to Donald, well, we have to separate Indian history from the history of the PPP. The PPP represents Indians, yes, they're loyal to the PPP, fine. But the PPP does not define Indian history or African history or indigenous people history. We have to define our own history. And we also have to recognize, even within our own community, when people who are representing us, in a sense, have transgressed right over that line, and in a sense, try to silence that Indian history, right? So we have to understand that and we have to recognize that. And I think that's also very crucial because we, aside from the education process, we have to interrogate the past. We have much more information. We have much more effective research tools, right, to be able to analyze and understand these things. And I'll end by this. Marjolaine Cars, right, a professor from MIT who came to Guyana, she wrote that definitive history of the 1763 rebellion in Guyana. When she made that presentation, when you look at the presentation that she made and you look at the audience and the students who are sitting in that audience and you look at the kind of questions that they ask, you know that those students are going to be social scientists. They're going to be concerned about, we don't have a lot of Indian politicians. We don't have, as Mr. Pereira, who was the leader of the OVD, said, there is no Indian Walter Rodney, there is no Indian George Padmore, there is no Indian so-and-so, whatever, right? And he may be correct about that. And part of that is because we don't understand that history and we can't speak confidently about that history. I mean, look at the example of the few of us here. Because we dare to speak about Indian history, we are called supremacists, we are called racists, even by the people, right, who we think in our head are representing our interests and understand our interests. In other words, they're negating the historical process that we're trying to explain, but they see you as the enemy instead of appreciating and understanding, right? So those words will come out and they will try to demonize you, but we have to rise above that. And it is a challenge. And I think by us speaking about these things, it means that at some point, hopefully, the minds of people who are listening would be liberated. And again, I'm not trying to sound arrogant, but that is the nature of the struggle we're dealing with. When you look at the way Indians respond, to these kinds of discussions, the knowledge base is not there. They will give you that one-line response, right? They will try to put down the other side or put down what you're saying because they don't understand. It's a level of ignorance that has to be cleared. And I think we have to address that and we have to be frank about that because that is the reality of what we're dealing with, right? Because it's part of who we are and it's part of this whole notion of having that dialectic discussion to talk about that experience and what it really means for us.
So Dr. Rammer talks about the why of unsilencing Indian history. I wonder if you want to delve a little more on the why of unsilencing history and also talk a little about how it can be done.
Well, before I answer your question, I want to compliment Donald Ramotar for the effect he has had on Professor Beturam Ramarak. Professor Ramarak now talks about dialectics. I am. It is clear that Donald has had a tremendous impact on Dr. Ramarak, and I think on the next program, I'm going to have to be a little wary as to how he may unfold his dialectic. Be as it may, how we can address it. I think of an example when I returned to the Caribbean late '89 and started living here officially by '92. Walcott had just won his Nobel Prize that year, right, for literature. And he gave, of course, as is usual, his Nobel Prize speech. And in that speech, he talks about how, coming from St. Lucia, he had moved to Trinidad since the early 50, 51, somewhere around then. And it was only decades later, having lived in Trinidad for that while, he's going towards Felicity and he encounters a Ram Leela being enacted. And he sees these performers who are not merely acting the role from the Ramayana, but being those characters, immersing themselves. You know, we hear about method acting of Paul Newman, Marlon Brando, but these people were performing something beyond method acting. They were totally immersed in that character. And when they played it, nobody was paying them. And for that moment. And Walcott is amazed that in the Caribbean, there was something like this which is being hidden. He didn't use the word silenced. Trullo hadn't written his book yet. He was writing in 92. Trullo wrote his book in 96. But what Walcott is talking about is that our culture has been so silenced that even he, one of our most educated men, had to be in shock to see this aspect of Indian culture unfolding. The Ramayana is an ancient text. The Ramcharitmanas that we brought from India, both having crammed it sometimes in the books, but we have it like my Nana used to recite portions, extensive portions just like that, and would have it as to guide his life. Walcott was not even aware of it. Why? Just as in Trinidad, how it was silenced, the same silencing occurred here. You have the Ramayana, a poem of 100,000 lines. You have people who know that. You have the Veda, 10 times that number of verses. You have the Ramcharitmanas with all the different kind of poetic forms and poetic sentiments being referred to in the very first opening words of the Ramcharitmanas. It says Varnanam Artasanganam Rasanam Chandasamapi. He talks about the words and the feelings and the sentiments you express, that you have to now go to college to learn about it. And that's an elementary aspect of Ramcharitmanas. Yet nobody acknowledges this. We from India brought the Quran that many Hafiz could have recited in totality. And that is why you had masjids and mandirs formed within a decade of them arriving in Guyana. You go to out in Waterloo there, you know, where those 40 people came off the Whitby and were sent to Waterloo. And there's a mandir there with a Shiv Linga. Nobody knows that. Nobody knows about it. So what it is that, you know, we can keep on giving examples, but what has to happen is, as Beto said, the process today in the modern state, the state has a role in defining what is education. The state now plays that role in defining what is education. When the British introduced education in India in 1832 through the Macaulay Minute, Macaulay explicitly announced in his minute to the Indian Parliament that all of the works of India's, all of the shelves of Indian literature, Veda, Ramayana, Mahabharata, they're not worth one single book of English literature. And so the very first place where English literature is taught is not in Oxford or Cambridge, which was founded back in the 12th century, but in India, when they founded the 4 colleges at Calcutta, Mumbai, and down in the south in Chennai, you know. So from the very beginning, there was this silencing, explicit silencing of the of what Indian culture represented, and that, of course, was transmitted with a vengeance when we landed in Guyana. So if you go to all of the archives, going back to what Crusoe said in Parliament, we were still defined as illiterate. Young Bahadur and others says, well, can't we have that they are literate in a Hindi, in an Indian language? That didn't matter. You had to be literate in English. the language that conquered their minds and made them into second-class citizens and defined them as slaves. They were insisting that we should now discard our language and adopt that language. And the language that whereas we live by was nonsensical. So coming back to it, at this point in time, the state in Guyana, the Ministry of Education, and all of the other institutions, University of Guyana and so on, have to take a stand and include on the curriculum these aspects of our history and our heritage, or else the fellows who are taking 19, 20 subjects don't even think of taking the history of the Indians in the Caribbean. As I always said, I did history when I did way back 50 years ago then it was called GCE. And the book that we did, right? The book that we studied for West Indian history by Sherlock, right? Out of 300 and something odd pages, I still have it in my bookshelf back there. Only maybe 5 or 6 pages was on the Indian lines in the Caribbean. So this has to stop. So we can start there as a beginning. There's more to come. The arts must include it. All of the aspects of what culture is should include the Indian element.
So you mentioned the state, and throughout the Caribbean, all the governments throughout the Caribbean are focusing on the African narrative, the African experience, slavery, and other experiences of the African people. But no government, not the government of Trinidad, not the government of Guyana, not the government of Suriname, even when they were being led by Indian majority or Indian dominated political parties, they never brought up this idea of the Indian presence, of Indian history, of Indian culture in the curriculum, or even in their pronouncements throughout the country. You mentioned reparation. There's reparation for slavery, but not for indentureship.
You see, that is correct, because you see in Trinidad, for example, Eric Williams consciously developed Westbrook into a center of African Caribbean artistic expression. So you had the theater there under Bernie McBride. You had, the bamboo. I think it was called tambo bamboo, something like that, where you hit the ground and made a sound. He then, in a sense, normalized Pan, which was something very much looked down upon. Pan was in the slums and was these renegades who were playing Pan. He then gentrified it by making it a part of the culture because of government support. Trinidad Carnival and what it is not fortuitous. Eric Williams consciously formed it out of all those institutions in Woodbrook. And when Burnham took office here, he then adopted all of those art forms in what they call Mashramani and just gave it a name, a so-called Amerindian name, which no one can find in any Amerindian language.
Dr. Ramarak, if you may summarize, and let's close it off.
Yeah, well, it comes back to taking charge and being able to write your own history and speak to your own narrative, right? That's important. That's something that the late Bridge Lal, who was a historian in Fiji, that's what he said. And the price he paid for that was because he understood the history of Indians, and Indians were being persecuted in Fiji. He paid a price. He was kicked out. So we have a bigger problem. We have, even among our intellectuals, don't see the issue like the way we define it, right? They don't talk about the Indian dilemma. They don't talk from an Indian narrative. Even in schools, when we try to do that here, even you remember in City College, there was no such thing, nothing about, even in the Black Studies department, we couldn't get a course on Indian indentureship, right? Because those things were considered, well, it's not something that you want to do. So we have to take charge, and we have to be the narrator who would be able to write our own history, because if we don't do it, and it comes back to this whole notion of what Michel Trolleau said about writing history, right? It's those who have the power will dominate and write the history for you. So we have to be able to take charge and put that history down and narrate that history the way we see fit, because you have to have that input, because who else would be more passionate about the history that you're writing, especially when it involves yourself, right? So, and I want to leave it at that.
Okay. Ravi, do you have any final word?
No, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for joining us tonight for this very, very informative, enlightened discussion on silencing and unsilencing of Indian history. We'll see you again soon. Do join again next Wednesday for another edition of Globespun 24/7, owned and operated by Mr. Nohar Singh. Thank you, Devin Bissoon, for joining us and for being the technical operator for tonight's program. Good night, all.
Good night.
No.